Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. It is June 14th today, Thursday, and we're going to be taking a look at two upcoming transits, Venus opposite Mars and Mercury opposite Saturn. So these are two transits that are coming in the next week here. They're going to be intensifying in the coming days. And, probably the two of the biggest items on the astrological menu right now, and people are looking at the stars and planets and sort of saying, all right, what's going on right now at this part of the middle of June? We just had a new moon. Talked a lot about the new moon the past few days, but now we're really trying to figure out what's going on with Mercury opposite Saturn and Venus opposite Mars. Those are the two big things happening right now that we'll take a look at today. So first of all, we'll start with Mercury opposite Saturn. One of the great reasons to take a look at this first is the fact that we have the moon moving into an opposition with Saturn as I speak. So you have a moon-Saturn opposition coming in Cancer today that's actually highlighting the kinds of qualities that the planets are reflecting right now. So the moon, you can think of as a kind of satellite, fastest moving planet in our sky, constantly weaving through the sky faster than any planet and changing face all the time. The light on its surface is always transforming. And ancient astrologers said that the moon was considered like the fortune of all. And one of the main reasons that it was related to this broad idea of fortune, which loosely correlates to the world of impermanent material changes and fluctuations happening all around us. For example, you can see some little flowers in the corner up here. I put them in about a week ago, and you water them, and then they get to a point where they wilt. And everything's happening like that all the time. Things grow, flourish, blossom, wilt, fall away, die. So that's the realm of fortune. That's the realm of karma. Fortunes rise and fortunes fall. They go up and they go down. The moon is related to that general realm of fluctuating changes. And so it's always important to look at what kinds of things are happening with the moon, because not only does the moon reflect those changes in the world, but because it itself is a reflective, large, massive mirror in the sky, it was thought to be collecting and distributing the energies and lights of all the other planets. It reflects the light of the sun, but it's also thought to gather up the light of all the other planets. How does it do so? By witnessing them through aspectual lines of sight. Some people don't know this, but the planets are constantly basically looking at one another throughout the entire circle of the zodiac through what are called aspects, which are literally thought of in ancient astrology as like lines of visual sight. So when the moon looks at other planets as a reflective light, it takes in the light of the other planet, so to speak, and then it distributes it. It reflects it. So the moon is like a barometer. You can always check out what the moon's doing to get a feeling of like what's going on at any given point in time. So on a day like today, when Mercury is closing in an opposition to Saturn and the moon is reflecting that, that's why I say it's a good place to start with. So always try to, offer a little education about astrology as we go. Why are we doing things? What is this, like that, and everything? So anyway, the upcoming transit of Mercury to Saturn, by the way, will be, it'll perfect over the next couple of days. It's, I'll give you the exact time that it perfects. It perfects Friday evening on East Coast time. So, tomorrow, basically, tomorrow night. But it's been in orb for, a little bit, a couple days, and it'll be in orb, meaning it'll be kind of within the range of effects and engagement, if you will. It'll be engaged with Saturn for over the whole weekend, even as it's separating. So the moon is highlighting and sort of amplifying this today. We can feel this. It's a new moon, just coming off from a new moon. The moon is also with Mercury really emphasizing that. We talked about this during the new moon talks, but the theme of marrying emotional intelligence to mental, rational intelligence. That's a big theme for this new moon. But then right away, it's like, oh my God, we're going to hit the opposition to Saturn. So what does that look like when Mercury makes an opposition to Saturn? What does that look like? Prognostication wise, what are we talking about? What kinds of things might you notice? Remembering again that the moon and its movements every day, it was called fortune by the ancient astrologers, and reflected all of the fluctuations of the material world that are always happening around us all of the time. So this is like a map for us. We can take a look at what's happening and say like, oh, hey, there's, I recognize these themes coming up. In the Indian tradition of astrology, the planets were sometimes referred to as grahas, which means grabbers. And the idea being, which we also have in ancient Greco-Roman astrology, that the planets were gods or the emissaries of the gods or demigods, and that they had the power to basically grab your attention and get you really wrapped up in certain kinds of fluctuations happening in the world. And we do have some free will, but it's very easy to kind of fall asleep at the wheel in life and just let these energies just kind of take the wheel and shift us around. So one of the main reasons we do astrology and we offer these kinds of insights is so that we have some sense of being a participant in these things, that we can also be awake at the wheel, basically. So having some awareness of what these things do, what kinds of complexes they tend to get us involved in, it can help us live a little bit more consciously. All right, but here's a passage I wanted to read to you. This is a passage from an essay by James Hillman, who was a famous archetypal psychologist and who was basically like the student of Carl Jung, and sort of a prodigy student of Carl Jung. And he's talking about Hermes, which is Mercury, and we're talking about a Mercury-Saturn opposition. So here's a good passage. In a culture that has lost the gods, a culture from which the gods have withdrawn, we have the messages, but they do not carry the gods' meanings. Mere information. Yet Hermes, in his dutiful faithfulness to his archetypal role, he's the messenger, passes on the information, indiscriminately facilitating the messages regardless of their content, which may as easily be a blog, a joke, an ad, a sexual come-on, or a revelation of crucial political significance. The word information itself has become so inflated that it carries the code of an individual's DNA identity and destiny. Not wisdom, not knowledge, not inspiration, not learning, not comfort, not truth, not prophecy, not moral value or aesthetic beauty. Instead of messenger of the gods, Hermes has become servant of the internet. I just thought that was really interesting way of putting it. He goes on to say this. I'll just read you one short little thing here. When we say, as in the popular guides to mythology, archetypal psychology, and astrology, that Hermes is the, quote, god of communication, we must recognize that communication cannot belong to only one god. There are many modes of communication. For instance, there is the connection, wordless, intimate, and sensate, between lovers, between mothers and babies, patient and nurse, animals and caretakers. There is communication by means of the daily delights of life, flowers, cooking. There is communication on the level of participation mystique in a group. Or perhaps you're chanting together, taking a yoga class with friends together. So he goes on, but the important point that he's making here is first of all that Mercury as an archetype, as in astrology we think of the planets in some ways as archetypes, meaning you talk about them as gods or demigods, or in modern psychological terms archetypes. They reflect something of eternal value and significance, and that helps us to see something eternal in our midst in everyday life. So Hermes is related to themes and patterns in life that reflect messages, communication, information. Mercury is the messenger. But what I love that what Hillman's saying is that we've stripped down information, of its real diversity. We've stripped down, for example, really, really hearing and really, really listening to someone or something. Instead of really attentive and careful listening, we have data retention. Instead of really careful communication, we have more and more like auto fill in forms, and we have thumbs up and emojis and all sorts of stuff that are supposed to convey how we feel or what we're thinking or what we'd like to say, but it ends up coming across more and more nominalistic, shaved down, pared away, and reduced down to something that really takes away the real heart and soul interaction between people. So I'm mentioning all of this because Mercury opposite Saturn, a planet that has themes related to privation and dryness and coldness and things like that. When Mercury's opposite Saturn, it can become a moment where we forget to fill how we communicate with others with actual substance. And it can become really acute, like your relationships can suffer right now. You can kind of say, gosh, I feel like you're not really hearing me, or I feel like you're not really listening, or I feel like you're not really coming to me from the heart. Those kinds of things can happen when Mercury's opposite Saturn. Even though, again, it's even more of a challenge to work through a Mercury-Saturn transit at a moment in history when the way that we think about Mercury, as Hillman was saying, is already so pared down and sort of reduced of all of its glorious multidimensional meaning. The role of a messenger in our life should be really rich. We should have teachers and friends and communication with people in life that is rich and that touches the heart and that enlivens our spiritual life and that is substantive and real. But again, because of the moment we live in technologically, Mercury is in some ways the role of information and communication has been stripped down. So we're already dealing with that challenge, and then you have it opposite Saturn, which can be about stern communication, harsh communication, severe communication, and it can also be about not really listening, not really paying attention, and stuff like that. So the challenges of this transit are about how do we listen from the heart? How do we hear others from a space that's generous and warm? How do we take things into our ears? I wrote about this yesterday, but how do we take things into our ears and our minds that are going to fill us up, fill our spiritual cups, and help us to stay in the heart, as opposed to getting caught up in so many mundane things that we do, but we're not actually present for. So, a lot of that comes down to what we put in our minds every day. Do we spend too much time on the internet, or do we put into our ears the sounds of gossip on all of the news stations, which is basically all that it is. It's information in the mood of gossip. And a lot of it's alarmist and really frightening and emphasizing all the rotten things happening in the world. But we put that into our ears a lot, and it can create within us a really hard and bitter feeling and mood, and we don't even realize it. We get in a bad mood. We don't know why. Well, because I just had CNN on for 20 minutes or something, Anyway, what we take into our minds and what we take into our ears is very important right now. You have to be careful with Mercury opposite Saturn that you're not creating a hard heart by what you're putting into your mind. So that's another Mercury-Saturn kind of thing. Another thing with Mercury-Saturn is about wisdom. And the mind, in our culture, in this sort of day and age, one of the other things that's is very common is in astrology you have Mercury signs opposite Jupiter signs. Jupiter in Indian astrology is often referred to as the guru, and Mercury is something more like the student, or the Jupiter is the message, the teaching, the Holy Scripture, the dogma. Or Mercury is the liaison, the communicator, the circuit rider, the person who goes out and shares the message. And when you have Mercury, you're often also talking about not only the student or the messenger, but also our sense of being individually minded. Like I have my own thoughts, my own opinions, my own beliefs, my own ideas. And whereas Saturn, like sort of similar to Jupiter, is thought of as the wisdom of age and time and maturity, the teacher, the elder, etc. Well, when Mercury comes into contact with Saturn, we also sometimes are ready to receive instruction or correction from someone who knows more than we do or has more experience than we do. And that can be very difficult because, again, in our culture, we tend to emphasize how important it is to be like a sovereign. I have my own sovereign will and my own mind and my own thoughts. And like, we have difficult relationships with authorities, authority figures, and with authority in general. Some of that is because, sometimes we didn't grow up with great authority figures, or, different. We grew up in a church where maybe we had a misuse of power, or we grew up with teachers who were corrupt, or, there's a lot of good reasons in some ways to doubt any kind of traditional authority figure. But on the other hand, it's handy for the ego to call on those memories of hurt, and it's handy for the ego to call on distrust and doubt at times when we really might need some correction or some healthy instruction. And so surrendering the mind to someone or something with more experience, more maturity than who we are, where we're at the moment, is also indicated by this Mercury-Saturn opposition. But it may not be easy. It may require swallowing our pride a little bit, or putting ourselves in a little bit of a submissive position mentally. And we don't like that, especially if someone has some strong level of correction to offer us. Now, the other thing that can just as easily happen with Mercury opposite Saturn is harshness. Well, Saturn is privation and sternness and strictness. And Mercury in Cancer is very soft and mental, but emotional at the same time. So you can think of that time as if you're a parent. Sometimes you want to offer a correction to a child, and they need to do something. It's good. If you don't correct them, they could hurt themselves. They need this correction. But you come out, guns blazing. You just correct them or chastise them in a way that's so harsh that the message is lost because they get hurt rather than helped, right? So sometimes we can also be overly harsh, overly demeaning, even though the principle we're talking about is maybe correct or virtuous, but the mood and the tone in which we address someone or something is too severe. Be careful of that with Mercury and Saturn opposing one another as well. So those are some good things to think about overall for Mercury and Saturn opposition. There's also you can think about a few other things that I actually had on my list that I'm almost forgetting. Mercury as writing, speech, communication, and Saturn as form and structure. It's a good moment to try to articulate something more formally, like, okay, I'm going to sit down and write something, or I've got to write a grant proposal, or I have to formalize a contract or something like that. So Mercury Saturn can offer a more formal or committed level of communication or negotiation, or trying to arrange an agreement or something like that. So those are other things that Mercury and Saturn can represent. Just remember, one of the deeper spiritual teachings available to us with a transit like this is the idea that we are creatures who we need the heart to be married to the head for the two to really work together. The heart and the head have to find a way of becoming together. We're starting a 4-part series on the Bhagavad Gita for astrologers tonight with one of my teachers in the area, Hari Kirtana Das. And he's going to be looking at the Gita, kind of breaking it down in 4 parts for us. And at the end, I'll be doing a little section that says, how does this apply to us as astrologers? One of the things that Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but basically says that when when people sort of approach God with a sincere heart and devotional attitude, like surrendering and speaking of, sometimes having a submissive mood, saying, I surrender my heart to you. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna basically says, when people surrender in that mood to me, I give them the intelligence that they need to grow in their relationship to me. So, the way that I might translate that for a general audience is like, if we surrender our heart and in our mind on some level to the divine in our daily lives, and I know that may look very different for different people, but the more that we do that, the more that the divine naturally infuses within us the intelligence that we need in life to deepen our spiritual life. So sometimes, the deep spiritual teaching that I see for Mercury, Saturn in opposition is to, on some levels, that surrendering the mind right now in the mood of reverence for that which is so much bigger than us can lead to a rapid development of our intelligence, and naturally the heart can be filled with wisdom that you can't quite get by just trying to think your way through a problem. And that's sometimes what Mercury Saturn means. Your mind is going to hit a roadblock called Saturn. So the mind, Mercury, and Saturn blockage. There's no quicker way than moving through a block than by just surrendering your heart to the divine and just saying, hey, I don't know what to do. I'm a little stuck. Maybe if I change my attitude and my focus to just loving the divine, then you could also do me the favor of filling me with the intelligence that I need to live life in a way that's naturally more peaceful. And that's what in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says that's how he reciprocates with people. So I think it's going to be a really cool series tonight that we're starting. So I hope that you'll check that out if you have the time. It's tonight at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, and I'll be giving a link today on my Facebook page again, like I did yesterday, for people to join if they want to. So, and at the end of each section, we're really sitting and going like, okay, here's the Bhagavad Gita, and what does this have to do with us as people who are astrologers or who are interested in astrology and stuff like that. So, all right, so the next transit we're going to talk about is Venus opposite Mars. Now, I also pulled on some James Hillman quotes for this one, and I just want to read a few passages from a book that he wrote called A Terrible Love of War. And the real purpose of this book that he wrote, and this is very relevant because the whole book, A Terrible Love of War, is looking at the juxtaposition between the archetypal and psychological themes of like love and war, love and hate, and what do we do with these things, especially what do we do with war? There's so much war in the world. Mars-Venus oppositions are, of course, known for the conflict between the masculine and the feminine, between war and peace and things like that. So what does it mean that we have Mars and Venus coming into an opposition? I'm going to read a few passages, but Venus is coming into an opposition with Mars pretty quickly here. It'll be a week from today and into next weekend. So over the course of the next week, this transit will be perfecting, and you'll start to feel these themes that we're going to talk about growing in the next week. I'm going to read a few passages. He was quite vivid as a writer and very poetic, but here's what he wrote at one point. Severed, and he's talking about war here, so there's a little graphic. I'm just giving you a heads up. Severed heads on stockade poles, on tree stumps, scalps, skulls delivered by the sackful, the cartload by victorious troops to their chief, Kali with her necklace of heads dancing on the funeral pier, Golgotha, place of skulls. The severed head is memento mori, warning of what war can do, does do. Long after the deeds are done, the gazing heads generate memories and replications, visiting similar sins upon unborn generations, much as the Bible says. Dreams bring back the dead. In the unconscious, nothing changes, said Freud. The souls in Hades are doomed to repetition. He's talking there about war, and one of the things he's saying is that there is a sense in which war is this atrocious thing, and yet it's a repetitive thing. It keeps happening. keeps happening over and over, and there's a fascination that we have with it that sucks us into it, and that is a part of generating the repetition of it. We see this in the news all the time, with getting sucked into the drama and terror and everything, and that generates a kind of repetitiveness. Here's another thing that he says. This is Hillman talking again. Since war's autonomy generates its own momentum, war has no cause other than itself. Is war something which really does have a life of its own, asks Barbara Ehrenreich. War's inhumanity tells war's truth. Its origins lie outside the human sphere, beyond human control. We have been misled, she argues, pinning war onto persons, politics, economics, gender, religion. It's the autonomy of war as an institution that we have to confront and explain. Her explanation is remarkably imaginative. She conceives war on the model of a living organism, a self-replicating pattern of behavior, possessed of a dynamism not unlike that of living things. Suddenly, war emerges as a fictive figure, a robotic golem, a brutal giant stalking his human prey. So another thing that really important that Hillman is starting to do is to help us recognize. Hillman was very big on helping us to recognize the reality of the soul. Now, one of the ways he does that is to say, look at what a thing of its own different human phenomenon are, like war. Like war is really a thing of its own. It's a creature of its own, and to look at it from that perspective helps us get some healthy sense of distance and detachment from it. As spirit souls, as eternal beings, we get sucked into a whole lot of things. The drama of life, the bad headlines, the violence, the terrorism, the war. And yet there's a weird way in which they all have a life of their own, and that's not really who we are. And there's a weird, like, kind of cognitive dissonance if you take a look at it really closely. And that's why I really like that passage. Both him and Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote that, if you ever read her book, Nickeled and Dimed, that was a very interesting book that she wrote years ago as well. She's a famous journalist. But Barbara Ehrenreich and him both are saying it's a life of its own. It's a thing of its own. This is very important because this again gets to that idea as the planets as grahas or grabbers. Carl Jung made the same observation about astrology, basically more or less, saying the gods have become our illnesses. These archetypal patterns that the planets point out are reflecting different kinds of patterns here in material nature, that if we study closely, and astrology can help us do that, we realize, wow, I'm actually something that's a little fundamentally different from all of that. I'm participating in it. Just for example, just like, or again, something we'll talk about in the Bhagavad Gita for Astrologers series, Arjuna's got a battle to fight. He's on the battlefield with Krishna, and he's like, I don't want to fight. This is terrible. Look, this whole thing is like a mess. Look at war. It's awful. But he still has a part to play in human life. Krishna actually encourages him that he has to participate, and this is part of his duty. But part of the message of yoga that Krishna imparts to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita has to do with a healthy level of realizing that's not who you are. So similarly with war, we have to first of all recognize it as its own thing, its own creature. So here's another passage. In short, unless we imagine war as inhuman in the transcendent sense, inhuman as the autonomy and livingness of a divine power. Remember, ancient astrologers, many of them thought of these as demigods. War as a god. Our secular models, as Susan Sontag said, cannot imagine and cannot understand. Now we can see that war's inhumanity derives from war's autonomy, and that this autonomy reveals war's nature as a mythic enactment explaining both its bloodletting as a ritual sacrifice and its immortality, that it can't be laid to rest. So again, what Hillman is saying here is that there's a way in which these terrible, and I would extend war here to mean just the fascination that we all have with cruelty and injustice and terror, and that it's there in the world, that it's a creature of its own. But here he's saying that one of the reasons that we constantly are drawn to it, while we also say it's inhuman, it's inhuman, it's inhuman, is that the soul is in some ways eternally different from these different kinds of fluctuations happening in the material world. And yet, because we're occupying a body, we're also easily sort of grabbed or pulled into these dramas all around us. Now, this is going to make sense for our Venus-Mars opposition more and more as we go. I have a few more passages that I want to read you. Here's another one. Now we're talking about Mars and Venus in the same book. Mars and Venus are always in the bed of the image, even when the tale says they fly off and away from each other. They remain an inseparable archetypal conjunction. There's the train. If you can, I don't know if you guys can hear that or not. They remain an inseparable archetypal conjunction. Where Mars is, Venus will be. Love and beauty, seduction, glamour, pleasure, intimacy, softness shall accompany Mars wherever he goes, Mars being the god of war. These camp followers belong to his battle train. The world of wars, horror, and fear is also a world of desire and attraction. We have come to another place where understanding our subject is again most baffled. War's beautiful horror, its terrible love and exhilarating fusion, called the sublime. I'm going to read more in just a second, but think about that for a second. He's actually saying there that one of the reasons that we get pulled into the fascination with the terror of the world, the warfare and brutality of the world, is that we actually have a love for it. There is the fascination with it. It says that there's some attachment there. There's some desire for it there. There's some sense of being glamorized by it. So you can't separate Venus from Mars ultimately. Similarly, it's amazing to see how in some of the most important moments of cultural and historical revolution and Renaissance, where there is the call for greater peace, democratic virtues, and values of that would look very noble and virtuous. There's also amazing self-righteousness, bloodshed, polarization, violence, and this is something that Hillman also looks at in the book. So, you know, think about the 1960s, right? In the 1960s, you have people, you know, placing the flowers in the barrels of the guns, and you know, the hippies and so forth. You have this movement of great love, the summer of love, and all of this stuff. But along with it, there was a great wave of destructive energy that came in. People were doing too much drugs. People were being greatly self-destructive in many ways. There was cultural renaissance, and there was a call for greater peace in the world, but there was also a kind of experimentation and recklessness and bravado and, you know, like this. So Hillman points these kinds of things out all throughout his book and saying you can't ever separate these two things from one another. So similarly, in astrology, at the core of understanding a Venus opposite Mars period in time is this idea that where there is war, there is the desire for war, there is the desire for peace. Where there's the desire for peace, there's the desire for war. Similarly, again, something we're going to look at in the Bhagavad Gita is that there's a moment where Krishna's talking about, you know, what he really basically admires, and this is sort of thought of as God speaking. So it's, you know, what does God look for in a human being, in a soul that's enlightened, so to speak? And one of the things he looks for is people who are somewhat equal in highs and lows, in love and war, in peace and conflict. Someone who can go through those different experiences with a kind of equanimity, being sort of detached from getting pulled and sucked into those things. And Hillman's basically saying the same thing all throughout his book, that there's a way of being in this world where we don't have to constantly imagine that you know, we're here, we have to create utopia, and we have to rid ourselves of war, right? And he's actually saying, no, that desire to rid the earth of all conflict and all turmoil and all violence is so intimately wed to violence and so intimately wed to conflict They can't ever be separated from one another in this material world. And so these are important things to keep in mind when looking at a Mars-Venus opposition. Yeah, we'll leave it there. There's more quotes, but I'll leave it there for now. Mars and Venus, when they're opposed to one another, will often represent the impassioned and invigorated state of desiring something that we feel is very virtuous and good and pure and clean and stuff like that. But it'll actually be we'll be impassioned by it in a way that is temperamental, that's volatile, that's embattled, that, so you have to be really careful of that. Mars opposite Venus, where it's the good thing, becomes a little Machiavellian. You do whatever it takes to get the good thing done. And that can lead to real problems. That can keep us locked in a kind of loop. We justify the drama. We say the drama right now, I have to be belligerent for the sake of peace. So just think about the way that Mars-Venus tension can generate all different kinds of justifications. The things that we think we that are good, that we have to do something that may not be so healthy for. So, that's one major way that the Mars-Venus transit can play out. Mars-Venus opposition can also reflect tension between the sexes, or gender sex sort of struggles. So you can see, don't be surprised if in the next week or two in the news you see the agitation of the battle of the sexes, right? And one of the things that what I love about this book that I was reading from, and the exploration of Mars and Venus that that Hillman was doing, is that he's also saying, like, look, there's nothing new. There's nothing new going on here. So in some ways, when these debates about different issues between men and women come up, or something like that, the battle lines are drawn, and so are the peace treaties. It's like a novel. If you've read enough fictional novels, you look at the headlines and you start reading the tweets and the things on social media. Hopefully you're not spending too much time doing that, but you look at those things and you go, I've heard all this before. I've heard all these familiar back and forths before. So be very careful during the Mars-Venus opposition over the next week of getting into familiar conflicts that are actually kind of repetitive aspects of this world that we inhabit. The soul, Hillman dares to say this, and I really agree with him, the soul doesn't find happiness in participating in those things. It's not made glad by participating in cyclical dynamics that it knows at the heart to be cliched, repetitive, predictable. So even if the cause looks really, really great, be careful, because all that glitters is not gold. A lot of the times, the causes that we take up, especially since most of us are taking up causes from the comfortable space of our laptop or cell phone, when we take up a cause, it can very quickly spiral us into 2 hours of debating with people in ways that, as we're writing, we're like, I can predict exactly what they're going to say in response, and they do, and I can predict exactly what I'm going to say in response, and how much time do we waste, right, with that level of intrigue and drama that happens in our lives? So you can think about Mars-Venus over the next week as also tempting you to get into different kinds of power struggles. And it can also be alluring. You can think to yourself, well, there's a whole bunch of really good progress that's happening here. We're a meeting of the minds has taken place. In Mars-Venus oppositions, people often talk about as opportunities for synthesis in relationships where there are conflicts. And that's true. It can definitely provide that. And there might be some good handshaking that happens in your relationships at work or love life or whatever. But just remember that on a certain level, again, I think it's important to recognize that, you and me, right, we're getting into something. And in a sense, it's very predictable. We sort of know the general parameters of where everything is going. And to the extent that that becomes the most important thing in our lives, I'm forgetting like, hey, you know what? I'm a spirit soul. I've never been born and I'm never going to die. And that's how you are too. What does it look like to relate to one another on that level? Right? And sometimes in order to do that, we have to put aside the theatrics of our conflicts, even the theatrics of the grand synthesis that we're hoping to achieve, some grand understanding of one another, because those understandings are temporary, and those understandings can just as easily lead back into future conflicts, just as easily and just as regularly as Mars and Venus keep dancing in circles in the sky with one another. That's just what they do. So, again, things to think about. Now, in less sort of being less pedantic about it here, Mars and Venus oppositions, generally speaking, do tend to bring up sexual tension, creative tension, and stuff like that as well. It's a short-lived transit. So remember, here's something that I like to think about. Let's say you wake up one morning and you feel this strong creative desire coming through. I need to do something. I need to make something. I need to create something. First of all, as someone who's expecting our second daughter in July, it's always good to remember that the things that you decide to create in a moment of impulse sometimes have lifelong homework assignments involved. So that's just important, and joy and beauty, of course, too. But always be careful of where you let the sexual impulses go, especially during Mars-Venus oppositions. But in a more creative sense, Mars-Venus oppositions can signify this really strong sense of creative tension. I need to do something. When you wake up first thing in the morning and you say to yourself, I need to do something with my day, and you don't have a plan, right? You don't have a specific plan of what is the most conscious way to prioritize my time that will help me advance my spiritual life or something like that, or that will help me get the duties that I have done, that'll help them get done in a good way. If you don't have a list of priorities and you just wake up with a strong creative impulse, a lot of the times what happens is you bite off more than you can chew. You decide, well, with this creative energy, which you think in the moment, you think yourself, well, this is never going to end. It's here to stay. I can do with it whatever I want. It's endless. It's a blank check. I can write it forever, however as much I want. But then what happens is you go out into the world and you get, 3 hours into some massive project that you think you're going to undertake because you're feeling that strong. You've been grabbed by the Venus-Mars opposition. And then you say to yourself, 3 hours in, I'm never going to finish this. Right? And then you quit. You don't get anything done. Maybe you were going to stain your deck. Maybe your deck needs staining. That was a project of ours last summer. And then you don't get anything done because you decided I'm going to get it all done today, versus maybe planning out a healthy first step to take, something like that. You'll get defeated, and then you won't do anything. And then that builds within you a sense of, well, I can't trust myself, or, that creative impulse, you become skeptical toward it or doubtful. And when that kind of, that Shakti or whatever comes in, it's important to use that constructively for things that you really should try to be advancing in life. So in other words, over the next week, Venus-Mars, a very strong creative impulse coming through Mars-Venus opposition. Best to have a plan. It's not a bad idea to sit down with a little journal and say, okay, what are the things I really need to take care of for me, for my personal spiritual health, or what are the things I really need to take care of for, my job or my family or something like that, and make a short list and then break it down into some manageable steps. When you feel those strong creative impulses coming in the next week, then you have something there, versus the two other things that can get you into trouble, which is not having a plan and therefore, getting scattered or biting off more than you can chew, getting easily distracted. Or the second thing that can happen, which is that if you don't have a plan, you do something a little reckless. How many of you have ever, for example, you've ever been to a yoga class, and you take a yoga class and you feel so good about it afterward? You're feeling like bright, aware, awake. You're thinking, this is great. And if you feel so good, and so what do you do when you feel good and you don't have a plan? hey, I'm gonna head to Cold Stone. I'm gonna head to Cold Stone and like get a big trough of ice cream or something because I'm feeling so good. A lot of the times when we feel good, and I'm just saying this because I've noticed this about myself and lots of my clients over the years, when you feel really good but you don't have a plan, it's easy to take that energy and just put it into things that won't help you continue to deepen your spiritual happiness, a kind of happiness that will stay, a kind of happiness that doesn't just stay for 10 minutes after a yoga class and then get burnt off by shoving ice cream in your face, So, now I should there's a lot more that could be said here, but the basic idea is do something constructive with the creative energy that you're feeling in the next week. So that really gives us some big things to think about in the realm of the Mars-Venus opposition. You know what to look for in the news. And another thing to remember is when you see Mars-Venus in the news, whether that means something's popping with the Me Too movement, or there's things going on with sexuality in the news, or human sexuality, or gender dynamics, or all of the different Mars-Venus tensions that can come up and manifest in the news, and in your relationships. Again, remember that simple truth, which is that the soul is usually looking for something deeper than participating in these dynamics that do nothing but predictably repeat. And so to find that authentic level of interaction, we have to find a deeper way of living our lives. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what that looks like, but just to be aware that the tendency to get sucked into these planetary dynamics is very strong. The other thing to remember generally, which we've said in a lot of talks, and I'll end with this thought, is that sometimes there are certain kinds of things that are going to happen in our life, events that are destined because of past lives, past karma, past choices. And the astrology can also indicate that there are certain things that are going to happen, and no matter how aware you are of the fact that the planets can grab you or take your attention, the planets are not just influences in our life. They are, but they're also reflective of natural forces that are a part of the karmic trajectory of our lives. And so there is some sense in which there are certain kinds of experiences that we are bound and destined to have because of the choices and desires that we have that have created this particular incarnation. So the Mars-Venus dynamic, in other words, in the next week, don't feel bad if you do get caught up in something. Don't get bad if you do get a little lost in something. And it's the same with the Mercury-Saturn, Don't get bad if you have a harsher or more difficult communication dynamic. If you go say you're a little too hard on one of your kids or something, and you have to learn a little bit from that mistake or something like that. The planets are also reflecting things that are in some ways destined to happen, destined lessons that we can learn from. But we're not always in control of everything either. And that's an important counterpoint to everything I've been saying today about how to navigate these transits and not get sort of lost in them. At the end of the day, in my opinion, something again we'll talk about in the Bhagavad Gita for astrologers class, one of the easiest ways to not get lost in the daily patterns, but also to be able to forgive yourself and learn from the elements of your destiny that occur all the time, is to be in the practice of surrendering your heart to the divine. That's what I see yoga as really all about, and something that I'm becoming more passionate about trying to include in my astrology work. Though it's been there for a while, as many of you know who come out to our yoga studio. It's a big part of our mission as a yoga studio community as well. So I hope that you're all having a very good day. I hope this was interesting, and I'll take a look at any questions in the chat box now before we go. All right, going up. A lot of people. Oh, hi, lots of people here. Hey. Visheshika Prabhu, hi. Brett, Sharon, Becky. Oh my gosh, Becky, haven't heard from you for so long. I hope you're doing well. Becca, good to see you. I bet you liked hearing about Hillman a little bit. All right, Sherilyn says Latin interpretation for competiere. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Means to seek together. Beautiful, beautiful. And the word yoga is very similar with yoking. Anyway, Joy says, I'm not sure which part you were referring to. I think that might have been earlier. Joy Lindsay says, there's something similar happening now. Great wave of spiritual awakening and the backward movement in insulation and desire for separation from differences. That's interesting. Yeah, I've been a part of several spiritual movements over time that have really emphasized, um, uh, an era of great spiritual awakening, and I think that this is good. It's good to be, excited and trying to help other people awaken to their nature as a spiritual being. But I think we also have to be careful of some of the hype that can surround that, because humans, it turns out, have actually been talking about the great, the great season of spiritual awakening and catharsis for thousands of years. You look, there's a great book that was written by Nicholas Campion called The Great Year. And in that book, Nicholas Campion really explores the way that there's always been people who believe that, right now everyone's waking up, everyone's getting enlightened, and people believe that in the 60s very powerfully as well. Not to say that it isn't true, not to say that there aren't great spiritual movements, of course, but it is to say that just, to just also be mindful of the way that the world, the material world, remains the way that it is. And you have to be very careful of utopian thinking, because this is some of my own beliefs speaking, but we become utopian about our ideas. It can easily miss some of the point, which is that there may be a difference between the spiritual world and the material world. The material world is often talked about as a kind of virtual reality. But it's not the real thing. And I just think we have to be very careful about thinking that the material world will ever become something, really perfect. But again, that doesn't mean that there's not waves of spiritual awakening that are happening. Good on my soul right now. Okay, good, Joni. I'm glad to hear it. Brett, Venus setting us up for Mars retrograde with Saturn retrograde in the eclipses of July? ? Rising above collective cold-hearted Saturn conflict Mars patterns. Yeah, I think, we need to be really I always try to take each transit one at a time, and remember that, it's easier doing astrology when you break it down to simple themes and patterns and stick with those. Trying to synthesize too many things at once, some people are very good at it, but a lot of the times it devolves into grand narrations, and nothing can live up to a grand narration, So in a sense, astrology, like all my talks, are sort of, taking these patterns and trying to tell a story about them themselves. So the simpler we can keep it, the better, in my opinion, but that's just me. Oh, hey, Bonnie. Nice to see you. And Tanya, I think they come in waves. Agree, same as it ever was. Yeah, again, I don't mean to be a curmudgeon. It's very important to realize that, ancient astrologers, a lot of them were Platonists, believed that this material world is not the soul's final destination. And so, although it's very important to, as Hillman said in one of his books, the ship is going down, it doesn't mean that you can't try to maintain the ship and keep order on the ship as best you can while the ship is sinking. That's how I basically feel about material reality. It's not ultimately who I am or who any of us are. It's fleeting and impermanent, but that doesn't mean that we should disregard it, look down our nose at it, or neglect it. We should take care of the earth. We should be concerned with human dignity, stuff like that. So, but it's important, because a lot of the spiritual movements get so utopian in some ways that it reflects more of trends and fads. You know what I mean? So, like, for example, many of the people in the 1960s have commented who came from the 1960s have commented on the way that so much of the culture of the 60s became Silicon Valley in the 80s. you know what I'm saying? And I'm just sort of paraphrasing quotes that you've heard from people like Steve Jobs and other people. Like, it's there's certain kinds of awakenings that happen during those great moments, like a Uranus Pluto conjunction, which was happening during the 60s, very revolutionary. But still, the energy can't be sustained, and it will devolve, and it will have all the kinds of predictable changes that you can imagine. You know, Che Guevara was a revolutionary up until he was a blacklight poster. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? So, and there's real effects, and then there's the de-evolution of everything that we think of as so great in the material world. So anyway, that's all I have to say for today. It was very nice hanging out with all of you, and we'll hopefully see you again sometime next week. And I will talk about over the weekend or next week, we'll talk about the Mars-Venus transit a little bit more. Well, thanks everyone, and take care. Bye.